Bright suns, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of the Canon Collector's Star Wars Canon Timeline Binge. We're checking out an arc from the mainline Star Wars comic series entitled Yoda's Secret War. It was written by Jason Aaron and Kelly Thompson, with art by Salvador Larroca, published by Marvel Comics. This arc spans issues number 26 through 30, and I was actually able to read them all for free with my subscription to Comixology. If you're new to this channel and interested in how this review fits into the rest of my Star Wars Canon Timeline binge, please make sure to go check out the explainer video that we posted on this channel. This video is spoiler heavy, not just for this comic arc, but for the majority of the Star Wars canon. You've been warned. Let's dive into Yoda's Secret War. So, to be perfectly honest with you guys, I don't have a whole hell of a lot to say about this comic arc. That's not saying that it was bad, but there's just not a whole lot to dive into with this. It wasn't totally bad, it wasn't totally good. It was, however, a really fun adventure, and with most of these stories, I think that's what we're going for. An enjoyable Star Wars adventure. It was great though to see a story about Yoda, get something a little closer to him, something that he's not necessarily just one of the other players in the story, but actually the main focus. Now, I don't want to deter anybody from diving into this comic arc. It was still really good. We didn't really get anything that kind of explained Yoda's backstory or really gave us much about the character himself, but it was cool to see how we would handle a situation like this. There's two groups of kids on opposite sides, they're tribal, kind of Lord of the Flies-esque, and he's got to babysit them to a certain degree. That was kind of cool. But I don't necessarily know if this is like the Star Wars adventure that I was necessarily hoping for when I dove into this comic. But it just continues to prove how wise Yoda is, how calm he is, how centered he is when handling these sorts of situations. The guy was literally up against a living mountain, and not only was he chill and cool, but he was able to stop the thing. Now, it might be a little unrealistic, but hey, it's cool. And it's Star Wars. This is fantasy, this is sci-fi. I thought it was neat. Definitely a thumbs up of a read, and it was definitely cool that I got to experience this for free. If you get the opportunity to check this comic out, definitely do it. But don't expect that there's a whole lot of meat and potatoes in this story. There is some cool stuff with Luke, and even seeing a little bit of Obi-Wan on Tatooine, but we'll get into that in just a sec.
So there aren't too many canon connections in this comic arc, but we do get a couple of fun Easter eggs, as well as a few canon questions. Off the bat, we get a great Gandalf reference with Yoda. Allowed to pass, you shall not be. In this comic arc, there's also a main focus on living mountains. The only other time we see living mountains introduced into Star Wars were the Ewok comics, specifically issue number 7, published by Marvel Comics. The use of living mountains in this story could be a direct reference to the ones we find in those Legends comics. The creature from those Ewok comics was named Mount Sorrow, which sounds suspiciously like a main character from this comic arc, Garo. We do get some more concrete canon connections though. We see Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan meet with Yoda on their way to Coruscant. This was a nice touch after reading Master and Apprentice. The timelines definitely don't work out, but the way I kind of play it off in my head is that we're actually seeing Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon on their journey back to Coruscant from Pygel after the events of Master and Apprentice. Again, that's definitely not accurate, but it does feel that way when you read all of this material in this order. I do have a couple of canon questions after reading this comic though. It does seem as though that Obi-Wan's journal was very detailed. A large portion of this story actually revolves around Yoda and his small stature. So wouldn't Luke have realized that he was small and green when he went to go meet him on Dagobah during Empire Strikes Back? It also seemed like Yoda was very hopefully waiting on Dagobah at the end of this comic arc. From what we know in the rest of canon, he wasn't very interested in training Luke, even more so than the fight we see him put up with Obi-Wan in episode 5. That particular hesitance of training Luke could have just been something that Yoda felt was necessary for Luke to evoke the specific feelings that he needed in aiding his training. However, if you look at one of the stories from the Certain Point of View books, we know that Yoda was not interested in training Luke, but interested in training Leia, thinking that she would have been much better suited on becoming a Jedi and eventually taking on Darth Vader. This particular instance could be read a few different ways, depending on what sort of tone and inflection you give Yoda's voice. So it's definitely not canon breaking. Both of these questions I have are interesting, and I don't necessarily think that they break canon, but they do add another level of question. But this is unfortunately just something you have to get used to as you dive into a franchise like Star Wars. There's so many creative personalities putting all of their twists and spins on George Lucas's original works, so you're going to have multiple interpretations of these sorts of events. It'll be interesting to hear more about Yoda's time on Dagobah as we move through the rest of this canon timeline.
So far, we've experienced Dooku Jedi Lost, the Fallen Order prequel comic Fallen Order Dark Temple, Claudia Gray's Master and Apprentice novel. Now we get this story about Yoda in a comic series. So how did I feel about this placed right after Master and Apprentice in our timeline? Definitely not as big as the other three that we read. I totally could have missed something huge in this, but I didn't see a lot of connective tissue between all of this stuff in this comic series. Now, this was a fun read. Like I said with Dark Temple, it's good to have kind of a fresh, fun palate cleanser in here. Now, the story does take place before Phantom Menace, and we do follow Yoda for the majority of this comic series. However, because this is a part of the mainline Star Wars comics that took place between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, there's a lot of Luke, Han, and Leia in this thing. So it definitely feels original trilogy. I don't know if I would have placed this story exactly where I did it in the timeline if I had read it beforehand. I do think that this story working as a flashback with the rest of the mainline Star Wars comics might have worked a little better. There's a lot of relation between Yoda's time on this planet as well as Luke in visiting that planet that I think might have played better if I had just waited for those other comics down the road. I could be completely off base, and there could be some more connective tissue. I could be having this comic in the back of my mind as I go through and see Yoda in other stories, but I'm not exactly sure if I will. Right now, I kind of wish that I put it off for a little bit and waited until a little bit later on down the road when I read the rest of the Star Wars mainline comics. Now, I'm not saying that this was a terrible place and it made no sense and that it wasn't a good fit for where we put it in the timeline, but there is just still a lot of what's to come that I wish I hadn't touched this early yet. Putting the Star Wars history nerd cap on though, definitely glad I read it where I did so that I can have the complete picture going into episode 1 and the rest of the prequels, but maybe this would have worked better as a flashback. Again, I enjoyed this, and I thought it worked fairly well in the place that it did, but I think it would have worked just a touch better if I had waited until a little bit later on in our timeline. The comic was a fun read, I really enjoyed it. It wasn't kind of the hefty, weighty stuff that we've been kind of discussing in a lot of our other material, but it was definitely a good palate cleanser, just like the Fallen Order comic. Place it where you will in your timeline, it'll be a fun adventure either this early or later on. So I feel like there's probably a bunch of stuff that I missed in here because I didn't pick up on a whole heck of a lot going through this comic. Let me know of all of the Easter eggs, canon connections, and everything I should be looking out for as we go through this timeline in the comments below. As well, if you've enjoyed this recap and review, make sure to give this video a like. And if you want to see more of my journey through the Star Wars canon, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hope you guys are all doing well, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, may the spires keep you, and may the Force be with you.